Good evening, good evening. We've got an important class tonight. Our fifth class of How Happiness Thinks. How's the happiness going so far? Is it good? Is it only like an hour and a half of learning and that's it? It's nice, a good class, or are these classes actually resonating and spilling over into the way we think during the week? Is it having its effect? Definitely. Okay, very good. It's spilling over. Okay, that's wonderful. Okay, I'm very happy to hear that. That's the goal, right? That's not just How Happiness Thinks. It's a nice class, but it's actually ideas that we could continue to live with. Here we are, lesson 5, titled When Joy Seems Elusive, Coping with the Pain of Loss. Okay, this is a very important topic. Here's a story. You ready for the story?
Yes.
There we go. Three Jews, somewhere in Florida. They're sitting around, taking it easy, sitting in a park bench. And somehow the conversation goes to what they want to be eulogized for. You know, what do you want to be remembered for? When the rabbi gets up there to give the eulogy, so what's he going to say about you? So the first guy says, I want him to speak about how I was a real community person. I was dedicated to the community. I was charitable. I cared. I helped build our community. That's what I want to be remembered for. The second guy says, what I really want is that I should be remembered as an amazing family person. I was a good dad. I was a good grandfather. Everybody liked me. I annoyed the whole family. I was a great husband. I was loving. That's what I really want to be remembered for. The third one says, no, what I want to be said at my eulogy is that the rabbi should get up there and say, look, he's moving. What? Not bad, huh? That wouldn't be such a bad idea. Okay. Dear friends, we have a sensitive topic tonight, an important topic, but a sensitive and a difficult topic, a raw topic. How happiness thinks. The premise of this course is that number one, the default position, the default disposition of a human being is to be happy. Happiness is not a feature. It's not something that we need to earn or develop. It's the natural state of who we are. To be unhappy is an imposition of who we really are. It's a mask over our true identity. And that happiness is not something that we like doing or like being in. Happiness is a Jewish value. Judaism wants us to work on our happiness and to make sure that we're being happy. And therefore, Judaism teaches us how to be happy, how happiness thinks. And especially when there's something in life that could and often compromises our happiness, Judaism gives us the tools of how to work through it in the right way, with the right approach, and to have the how happiness thinks mindset. Now, one of the areas of life that is definitely a real downer and is a struggle is when we face what we call traumatic loss, the loss of life. And maybe perhaps a little bit of an irony that we're talking about a How Happiness Thinks course, we're talking about such a topic. But yeah, if we want to be real, how happiness thinks, we have to address this topic of mourning and grieving and the whole idea of dealing with a traumatic loss, the pain of loss, which, as we see, it hurts so many people. That when we go through it, we feel that we can never be the same person again. We feel this gaping hole, and it could really be something that really hurts our sense of happiness. That is going to be today's topic. Before I begin, I want to make a few little disclaimers, and to set the class on the right path. Number one, this is not going to be a philosophical class. It's not going to be a theological class. We are not dealing with theology. We are not going to be asking the questions such as, how could a good God do bad things? Or how could evil be there if God is, all these types of questions. And how could there have been a Holocaust? This class is very, very personal. It's all about how does Judaism teach us to deal with the pain of loss, with going through mourning in a way that is productive and healthy and happy, and even in the way of how happiness thinks. How does Judaism want us to have the right attitudes as we go through this phase of life? That's number one. So philosophy, theology, theodicy, which is the proper official philosophical term, right? Max, you know what I'm talking about? Theodicy is the word for the official conundrum of how a good God, who is also a provident, all-knowing God, all-powerful God, and good God, how there could be evil. That's the theological conundrum called theodicy. Okay, now for today, we've done classes about it in the past. We'll hopefully do more about them in the future as well. This is very much focused about us personally, how Judaism guides us in a very personal, real way. That said, I need to, and I'll tell you honestly, preparing for this class was very difficult because thank God I've never gone through a first degree loss, and for sure not a traumatic loss. So I don't know what it is. So it's easy to be a rabbi and preach from the pulpit about how Judaism wants us to work through pain, but it's easy to preach, right? It's easy to say. And I'm in that position. So I want to share with you openly that my position is one of humility and is one of, I just want to try to be a transparent conduit for the wisdom and the truth of the Torah, how the Torah teaches. This is not at all about me saying what my good ideas are or me speaking from a place of judgment or speaking from even a place of experience. I have no experience. May God spare me of any such difficulties for many, many long, happy, and healthy years. So I'm just going to try to be as transparent as possible. The teachings should just come through me, and that's it. Like there's this little story. You want to hear a little story?
Sure.
There was a rabbi in Europe, pre-war, early 1900s. He had a yeshiva, and he had a yeshiva because he inherited the business from his wife's parents. He got married to a wealthy family. He inherited the business, and it brought him such a beautiful income that he was able to support his family and an entire yeshiva, which was a very big feat in those times. And the business was, I think it had something to do with lumber. They would process lumber very far away, and they would have boats and ships. Some type of merchandise on ships. It was come and go. And the way it worked was that once a year, they would process all of the lumber, I think it was again, or whatever all the merchandise was, and it was one shipment, and that would cover the whole year's. What happened was that one year, the boat that had all of his merchandise, it sunk. And his entire livelihood, the whole business for the entire year, went down to the bottom of the Atlantic. And they had to break the news to him. So there were the older students, who were his close students in the yeshiva, were trying to figure out how do we break the news to the rabbi. So one of the students came up with an interesting, smart way of doing it. He went to the rabbi, and he said, I don't understand. The Talmud tells us something. The Talmud says that one should rejoice one should accept, this is what the Talmud says, one should accept bad news just as they accept good news. What does that mean? So the rabbi said what it means is that just like when you hear good news, you're happy, so too when you receive bad news, you should also be happy. So since I don't understand it, when you receive bad news, it's bad news. I don't understand. So the rabbi says, but this is what Judaism wants of us. When we hear bad news, the same way if it's very good news, we get up and dance. When you hear bad news, get up and dance. The student says, I don't understand. Literally, you hear good and bad news, you dance. He says, yeah. If you hear bad news, Torah wants to literally get up and dance. So the student says, dear teacher, maybe you start getting up and dancing. Maybe time to get up and dance. And the rabbi understood what happened, and he fainted. What's the moral of the story? What's the moral?
It's easy to read it in a book.
Exactly. It's easy to preach. It's easy to read ideas in the abstract. When life is real, it's real. So, I want to be honest about that, in that sense of, and in general, it's a very healthy attitude. There's a Jewish saying that when one goes through a personal tragedy, you work through it. We use the tools from the Torah to not let it defeat us, not let it deject us. not let it pull us down, work through it. But when somebody else's tragedy, you cry for them. Don't philosophize your way out of other people's tragedies. Your tragedy you work for, but somebody else's, you have no right to lessen it. For another person, you cry. That's a very healthy Jewish attitude. Everything we're learning tonight is very personal. It's about how we in our own lives can maybe help ourselves out, especially when we're dealing with a difficult time, to have the right tools to work through it. But God forbid to use these ideas as a way of judgment, saying, oh, that person shouldn't be doing this or shouldn't be doing that, or is taking this too hard. That's very not Jewish. And there's an idea about that in the Torah. When Judah and Joseph were united, it says each one cried on the other one's shoulder. Very interesting. They weren't crying together. They each crying over the other's shoulder. Or over each other's necks. That's the line. They were each crying for each other. They weren't crying together. They were each crying for each other's loss. You don't cry for your own. For your own, you deal with it. Interesting idea. So it's Jewish to cry for somebody else's pain, and we're never callous towards somebody else's pain. For your own pain, Judaism wants us to try to learn and have the right tools to work through it in a healthy way. So dear friends, we're talking today about the pain of loss when joy seems elusive. This is going to be the plan for tonight. Let's first do a very basic overview of the psychological model of dealing through grief and pain. Then we're going to look at the Jewish model of mourning and grief. And we're going to see how Judaism differs and what's the very unique and a very beautiful approach that Judaism has built in to the process of how it's built into Jewish law, how we deal with mourning, how we deal with the loss of life, and the attitudes, and we'll see how they match up. And very interestingly, we'll get a very unique and a very clear understanding of the how happiness thinks, even in this painful part of life. So dear friends, in the world of psychology, and the mental health professionals here will corroborate if what I'm saying is correct, the most famous model that is used of how we deal with the pain of death and grief is what's called the Kubler-Ross model. There was an American psychiatrist, her name was Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and in the 60s she published her findings. She did a lot of research. It started off that she was really doing a lot of studies on patients dealing with terminal illness who were facing their own death. And she studied them and saw the different phases of them dealing with their own grief, of their own situation. And then she also studied other situations of dealing with traumatic pain, such as separation from a loved one, like a divorce, how children deal with divorce, of course, the loss of life, which is what we're going to be talking today, loss of a loved one, and other such types of serious traumatic blows, like a major financial situation. Okay. What she came up with is what's called the 5 stages of grief, which I'm going to put up over here. These are the 5 stages, and it's in your books on page 154. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Let us read the 5 stages over here on page 154. Step number 1 is denial. Because the reality of loss is hard to face, one of the first reactions is the attempt to shut out the reality or the magnitude of one's situation and to develop a false, preferable reality. That's the first step. You hear bad news, you're facing a very shocking, unfortunate news. First, right away, we have an emotional denial. We shut out the pain. That's step number 1. Step number 2 is anger. The person is overcome with a sense of outrage over what has occurred to him or her. He or she is plagued by the questions. Why me? How could God allow this to happen? The anger might be directed at oneself, at God, at the departed loved one, at those close to oneself, or toward a third party who is seen to blame for the tragedy. Step number 3 is called bargaining, which actually is the least relevant to our specific discussion of death. Okay, but bargaining is the person makes all sorts of bargains with himself or with a higher power in the hope that this can somehow undo the cause of grief. Okay, death, as I said, it doesn't really apply because by death it's already over. But in the case of dealing with a terminal illness, there's a phase called bargaining. Number 4 is depression, which is as the reality of what has occurred sinks in, depression takes hold. My life is over. There's no point of going on. Why bother with anything? The person withdraws into a lonely, paralyzing grief. And step number 5 is where we, in the world of psychology, this is where we want everybody to get to, which is step number 5, acceptance, which is the person comes to terms with the tragedy, accepts the new reality, and regains emotional equilibrium. Get back to a healthy pace of life. Okay. These are the 5 phases of grief. Now, very important to point out that everybody grieves differently. Nobody mourns the same. It's a very personal process. Nobody deals through pain. Nobody deals with trauma the same way. So, Dr. Kubler-Ross points out, and of course it's important to point out, that this is not going to look the same by every single person. Some people are going to have stronger a stronger phase of one of these 5 phases. Some of the other ones will maybe barely be there. Some people will maybe not even have one of these phases. Also, it doesn't have to be linear. Some people have one phase before the other phase. It doesn't necessarily follow this exact pattern. So there's going to be a lot of variables from person to person. But generally speaking, the studies show that these are the 5 steps of dealing with grief. And of course, the goal is to get to acceptance. Acceptance is back to health, is back to an equilibrium. Here's what I want to discuss with you for a moment right now. Okay, bargaining is not really relevant to our discussion today, right? Bargaining is only when it's not the end of the line yet. When we're dealing with death, the death already happened. There's nothing to really bargain about. So bargaining is kind of out of our conversation for today. Acceptance is healthy and good, right? Acceptance is the goal. Let's focus on these 3, denial, anger, and depression. I want you to take a look over here on page 155. We're not going to do all these questions, but let's just look at the table over here, okay? This is very important. Denial, anger, and depression. I want you to choose how you would categorize these 3. Are they beneficial and necessary? Is it not beneficial, but it's unavoidable, it's just part of what's for sure going to happen? Or is it not beneficial and it can be avoided or overcome? So which 3 of these steps are good? Which one of these 3 are necessary evils? Which one of these 3 are bad and could and should be avoided? I want you to think each of these 3, circle one, and then I want to have a little bit of a discussion with you why you think that and how we as a class feel about these 3 specific phases of grief. Let's get some ideas on the table. Let's start with denial. What do you say about denial? You have 3 options. Is denial beneficial and necessary, not beneficial but unavoidable, or not beneficial and avoidable? What do you say?
I think it's actually, putting it as sort of the first thing that happens, I think it's somewhat beneficial.
It is beneficial.
Because you can cope with something overwhelming, or maybe you can't cope with something overwhelming, so denial allows you to ease into it a little bit more than maybe life led you.
Got it. You're saying right away, it's such a big shock that what happens is, we see this by a lot of people, they right away just create this shield, this barrier, saying no, where they mentally and emotionally just try to lock it out, and that lets them then on their own, at their own comfort, ease themselves into the process of mourning. Interesting. So denial actually is a helpful tool that allows you to then ease into it in a healthy way. So you would say it's beneficial. Very good. Any other thoughts for denial? Anybody disagree with that?
I could say,
Sure.
for me, instead of denial, it was more like surrealistic. Like it just was so hard to believe. It wasn't denial.
And was that in a way that you couldn't even process the emotions?
It just, it just didn't, it just didn't seem logical, you know? So it wasn't like I was denying it, but it was just hard to imagine.
It was more than you can handle. Yeah. So what would you say? Was it beneficial? Was it not beneficial? Was it avoidable? Was it not avoidable?
It doesn't, it just, it was there. It
Saying you
just,
experienced it on some level.
yeah.
Okay. All right. So far we have Max saying that it's beneficial, it's important, it does a good because it helps you ease into it. Okay. Would anybody say that denial is not healthy? Yes.
I see it possibly as allowing you to build a new reality that prevents you from moving on.
And denial also is a form of running away from life, you're saying.
Yeah.
You're saying you have to move on, you have to deal with it, actively deal with it, and denial is unhealthy. So I guess it always depends what type of denial we're talking about. Is it a half hour of denial, or is it 10 months of denial, right? It's like, is it something that's robbing you of living life because you're just stuck in that in your own world? You built a wall around you and you just lock yourself in, right? So I guess it depends what denial looks like. Okay, but all right. So you're saying it's not beneficial. Okay, who agrees with who? Who says it's beneficial? Raise of hands. Denial beneficial. Who says it's beneficial? Not beneficial. Who says it's not beneficial? A lot of people are pleading the fifth over here.
I think it's both.
Oh, that's a good Jewish answer. It's both. No, you're right.
My analogy is a runner got the hit, the throw to first base, and the runner and ball came at exactly the same time.
So it's a little bit of both.
He's neither safe nor out, and now the umpire has to make a decision.
Right. So it's
The
a case by case. It's a case by case situation. Okay, very good. So we're split. That's good. If we're all unanimous, that's not good. Okay, very good. Anger. What about anger? Is it beneficial? Not beneficial? Avoidable? Not avoidable? What do you say? Any thoughts on anger? What do you say?
It's beneficial, just as denial, it's all part of the process.
Oh, so you're saying it's all beneficial, it's all healthy because it's all part of a process.
To a certain degree, I think that all three can go to a realm where it's not healthy anymore. Like you could be in denial and then completely get lost and set the table for your loved one that passed away, and then you need eventually probably psychological treatment. But if it's just a short period of time, then it's normal and healthy and you can move on. It helps you to move on later.
Right. So it's all about balance. They're all part of a process. Of course, any of these could be taken a little bit too far and start becoming damaging, but you're saying they're all beneficial. Okay, very good. Who says otherwise? Anybody for an argument otherwise? Yes.
I picked the middle choice, not beneficial but unavoidable. And the reason I did was that I happen to think personally that everything we do and experience is based on your genes.
So you're saying if it's anger, then you can't control anger.
Well, it's just unavoidable.
It's unavoidable to at least for some moment feel a sense of anger. But you're saying it's not beneficial. Why is anger not beneficial?
Well, I think it's a mixed bag. The middle choice, well, but unavoidable. Well,
Again, but why is it not beneficial? What would be the problem with anger? So you have anger. What's the problem? Yeah.
It can be destructive, particularly in this moment of grief where the other people who are around you are also grieving. The last thing you want to do is lash out at somebody in anger.
Right. So first of all, high emotions. It's a very raw moment. You're dealing with real pain, and you don't want to be in that situation. But on a personal level, on a psychological level, is it not healthy for your own grieving process, or you could say it's part of the process? Beneficial, harmless, or is it harmful? Is it not a healthy place to be in, or it's just okay? That's okay. You could be in that place.
I'm going to plead the fifth on this one. It's sort of both. It depends on whether it can be used as a very powerful energy,
Right.
or it can be very, very destructive.
Right.
The emotions that are within you are going to come out somehow, or you're
Right.
going to wind up in the depression state.
We're getting there. They're getting there in a moment.
Far deeper, because you have to let some things out. On the other hand, anger can be extremely unhelpful and unhealthy in that kind of a situation.
Right. So again, it's a little bit of, it all depends. Yes, Gary?
Does it matter who the object of the anger is? Is it the hospitals and doctor that screwed up?
At
Or
this
the person
point-
who lived a life that was not, it was self-destructive? Or his parents who gave him the wrong genes? Or,
According to Kubler-Ross, it's anything and anybody. It could be against God, it could be against yourself, it could be against, it could be, yeah, it can even be against an inanimate object.
or whether it's beneficial or not? Doesn't
I'm upset at alcohol. He died from alcohol over it. I'm upset at alcohol. That's my anger. So it could be anything, according to this model. But of course, it would be a different type of thing if you're, it'll be a different type of experience based on what you're angry at. But according to the model, it could be anything. Yeah.
When you have anger, it clouds and covers all other emotions.
So in that sense, you're saying it's not healthy?
And it may not be true anger.
Oh. So it could be a misguided expression of your high emotional state.
It's just it could be an immediate release,
It's just an easy release, which may not, in fact, be healthy.
right?
Because you're not actually dealing with the actual pain. You're just lashing out. Yes?
I think there should be one more category,
Oh,
or taking over.
you don't argue with me. You got to find Mrs. Dr. Elizabeth.
Instead
Yeah.
of bargaining, I would say guilt.
Oh, maybe that's a form of anger. Could that be? Anger at yourself? Or
Or anger at a doctor, guilty that you didn't intercede to.
I maybe could have done something to help here. Right. Okay, that's interesting. I wonder where Dr. Kubler-Ross would put the guilt, unless it's a uniquely Jewish situation. Could that be? Is Kubler-Ross Jewish? I don't know. Ross could be Jewish, Kubler not. Yeah, no. Okay. All right. Close enough. Okay, depression. What do you say about depression? Beneficial? Necessary? Inevitable? Not, avoidable? What would you say?
Can I go back to the anger one just for a second?
Yeah, sure, Leah.
Well, because I think about the Jewish interpretation of anger as being something like idol worship. So I guess I would like to try to avoid that if I could.
Right.
Because if it's something that came from God and you're angry at God, that's not a good place to be.
Right. Right.
So-
Okay. That's a uniquely right. So from a Jewish perspective, we have our own beliefs about anger. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Yeah. Okay. Depression. What do we say about depression? Let's get some opinions on the table. Yeah.
I think depression can be partly based on the relationship you had with the person who died. That you may be depressed because you never resolved the issues. You may be depressed because the other person never resolved the issues. I think there's all kinds of reasons for depression and how long it lasts.
So you're saying it could be beneficial, could be not beneficial? Is that what you're saying?
I don't
We
know
wanna-
if
we
it's
wanna-
really beneficial.
You don't think it's beneficial?
It might be kind of, in some cases, where you're able to release it when you come out of the depression, that feeling.
So you're saying if it helps you release it, then maybe it is healthy. Well, depression, I think, is not. I think depression is the general idea that you just feel extremely down in a very debilitating and a very paralyzing way. I don't think it's necessarily about, I wished I could have resolved the issue. That's maybe guilt. I should have made amends. I could have visited them more, that type of thing. I think it's just a very large depression over realizing what is happening. You're just like, it's a certain form of defeat. Like, I'm done being angry. I'm done being in denial. I'm done even trying to bargain. Now I'm just defeated. Okay, I lost. It's a form of surrender.
Let it be known. Depends on your age.
That's the way I think of it. Yeah.
Isn't depression, I'm no expert by any stretch of the imagination, but isn't depression anger toward anger turned inward?
Not necessarily.
No?
Not necessarily, no. I like how they write it over here. As the reality sinks in, you start feeling my life is over, there's no point of going on. You stop waking up in the morning, you stop eating healthy, you stop taking care of yourself, you stop living a productive life, and you just withdraw into a lonely, paralyzing grief. That is going to be our definition of depression here, yes?
I think my father was killed in a car accident coming home from work. And he worked at Ford Motor Company, and he worked afternoon shift, and this happened at midnight. And we got a phone call that he was injured and he was at the hospital. My brother was married and he came to get, my mother didn't want to go to the hospital. I didn't go. And it's like putting it together for you in your age where you
How
are.
old were you?
I was 17 when he died. And it was hard, it was very hard. It was
For sure.
I mean, I hadn't been around him. My grandmother died when I was 5, and everybody was sitting Shiva, and I went around and talked to the uncle, and everybody had something to say. Being 5 years old is different, but this was a very hard thing.
Yeah.
To accept it, and we were angry, all of those things are applicable.
You felt the whole
The whole
this.
thing. The whole thing. And my brother ultimately got through it. He's 11 years older than I, and he had a mental breakdown.
Like,
So after that, he was never the same.
like.
So it's a tragedy. It depends how old you are when you are put into it, and depends how the family accepts it or doesn't accept it.
Right. So what would you say, from your experience about depression, would you say that it's beneficial or no?
I think in a way it is, because you get to live with the loss. You get a feeling of family around you.
No, but this is withdrawing into loneliness, into you start shutting down on life. You start living in paralysis.
But knowing that the people around you feel the loss as well, I think gives you a little bit of.
I don't know if that's depression. I'm asking depression itself, a sense of depression. But do you think that itself is beneficial? Anybody for beneficial of depression?
It cannot be beneficial.
You say it cannot be beneficial.
But it cannot be, it's like,
Oh.
this is normal. To be
But it's
depressed
unavoidable.
and this, yes.
Right. Oh, okay. So you're saying you're choosing the second one. It's not beneficial, but it's also unavoidable. Okay, dear friends, these are the 5 steps of psychology. Keep them in mind. We explored them and we thought about them. If they're productive steps or not, or if they're just necessary steps, just inevitable steps, just part of what happens. Now let's turn to Judaism. When we start looking at the Jewish model of grief and mourning, we're going to see a little bit of a conundrum, okay? A little bit of a paradox, and this is what's going to propel us into understanding the Jewish model. Let's turn to text 5. I'm skipping a few texts over here, okay? Page 165, text 5. Let us start with Jewish law. Is mourning a good thing, a bad thing? Is grieving a good thing or a bad thing? Let's look at text 5, Max. Page 165. Let's do this.
It is an imperative commandment of the Torah to mourn the death of close relatives.
Okay. Mourning is not optional. It's not a recommendation. It is a positive commandment. There's a mitzvah. There are 613 mitzvahs in the Torah. One of those mitzvahs are that for a first-degree loss, first degree meaning a parent, a sibling, a spouse, a child. Am I missing any? There's a mitzvah to mourn. And these are not optional. These are obligations. These are commandments. It's a mitzvah to mourn. It's a mitzvah to keep Shabbos, mitzvah to keep kosher, a mitzvah to put on tefillin. It's a mitzvah to mourn. And in that sense, Jewish law takes mourning very seriously. I want to go through with you, at least on a very basic level. Don't rely on this to give you the full the full code of Jewish law, how to do this. But I want to just walk through with you 4 phases of Jewish grieving and mourning observances on page 166. Key Jewish mourning observances. The first one is called Kriya. Kriya means tearing. This is the very first phase of mourning. The mourner tears his or her outer garments. Mourner tears his or her outer garments opposite the heart as a sign of mourning. This usually happens. So according to Jewish law, the burial should take place right away. There's very little reason in Jewish law to leave the body exposed and not buried. We really try very hard that, that day, the next day, but, really get straight to it to bury the body. And it's considered a disgrace to the body. A body should not be kept out in the open, even if it's kept in a morgue, in a freezer. A body should be buried right away. So what happens is the morning, at the beginning of the funeral, when the family comes to the funeral home, before the actual funeral begins, each of them should rip their outer garments. You don't rip your own garments. According to Jewish law, somebody else should do it. They take a razor. If you're wearing a jacket or a shirt, they rip it, and there's an exact measurement of how big the rip has to be. That's the first step of mourning. The next step is, as soon as the funeral is over, the burial is over, there's what's called the Shiva, which is a 7-day mourning period. For 7 days, we're in active mourning phase. In this time, mourners are forbidden to work. Forbidden, right? Not that you don't need to work. A Jew is not allowed to work during Shiva, and it's a mitzvah for them to stay at home. It's a mitzvah for others to visit the mourner and to speak about the life of the deceased. That's what happens in a Shiva home. We want to celebrate the life, discuss the life, speak about the good qualities, good memories. That is what the Shiva home is there for. That's the week. After a week, we have the phase called the Shloshim. Shloshim in Hebrew means 30 days, 30. Which is that after 7 days, the Shiva ends. We leave active mourning, but as long as we're within the first 30 days after the burial, we still continue some mourning practices, such as we don't get a haircut, we don't join any festive occasions. You'll have it here in your book. It has refraining from wearing new clothes, no new clothing during these 30 days, no putting on a new suit, no getting haircuts, and no participating in festive occasions. So the Torah wants us to still be in a certain active mourning phase. But after 30 days, we go into the year, which the focus is called meriting the soul. This period of time for the next 12 months, until the first yard site, we are very focused on doing mitzvahs, doing good things in honor of the deceased soul. So we say Kaddish. Kaddish is recited for 11 months by the mourner. And on every yard site, good deeds such as charity and Torah study, particularly learning Mishnayot, are dedicated for the elevation of the soul. These are Jewish mourning practices. And again, Judaism takes this very, very seriously. They're not optional, they're not recommendations, they are obligations, a mitzvah. Now, what happens if somebody says, you know what, I'm not really in the mood of mourning that much. A whole Shiva, a whole 7 days, it's overkill. But I'm ready to go to work after 2 days. What does Torah say? No. Get back to Shiva. Shiva's not over. It's your obligation. No cutting it short. The Torah goes as far as to say, unbelievable words. For the code of Jewish law to say this is very rare. The code of Jewish law says that if somebody who does not mourn properly, somebody who does not keep a whole Shiva, it's an act of cruelty. Cruelty. It's a very severe word for Jewish law to use. A law textbook by nature should never be hyperbolic, right? It's law. It should be very cold and thorough and analytical and precise, and that's it. You don't just throw out words. Whoever does not mourn in accordance to Jewish law is a cruel person. Is a cruel person. Cruelty. Which means this is what you need to do. So Jewish law takes mourning very, very seriously, and it needs to be done. On the other hand, there's another text over here. A text from our sages. Max, read this as well. Page 167, text 6.
Do not weep for the dead, and do not bemoan him, Jeremiah 22:10. Meaning, do not weep for the dead more than is the measure, and do not bemoan him more than is the limit. How so? 3 days for weeping, 7 days for eulogy, 30 days for refraining from grooming and haircutting. Beyond this, God says, do not be more compassionate towards him than I am.
But Jewish law then says, for 7 days it's a mitzvah to mourn, and you better mourn. But then let's say somebody says, I'm not ready to move on. I need to have a little bit of a longer shiva. I'm not ready to get up. You know what Jewish law says? Well, that's forbidden. You got to get up now. So it's an interesting paradox, and I want to put this up over here. On the one hand, it's a mitzvah to mourn. To not mourn is cruelty. But then, if we're supposed to mourn, why is a little bit too much mourning forbidden? Can't go any more. Can't do any less. You can't either do any more. So what's the logic over here? If it's a good thing, it's a good thing. If it's a bad thing, it's a bad thing. And what we're learning over here is that there's a certain sense of nuance. There's a unique Jewish understanding of what mourning is, what it should look like, what its purpose is, and what the process is. And that's what I want to unpack with you for the next 45 minutes or so. You know, in the English language, we have a word called grief, which is the sense of being in this emotional distress. You're grieving over the loss of a loved one. And that's the word called grief. The problem with the word grief is that it includes everything. Whatever you're feeling is all called grief, which makes it a very improper word to use. Grief could look very differently from person to person, and it in fact has many different types of emotions. There are two parts to grief, and I want to separate these two. One part of grief we're going to call outrage and unacceptance. Outrage means I'm very upset, I'm angry, or I'm depressed, I feel cheated. I feel cheated out of life. It was not fair, it was unjust. I was wronged, this person shouldn't have died. And therefore I don't want to accept it, and therefore I'm upset, I'm outraged. The second form of grief, which is very different, we'll call emptiness and loss. Emptiness and loss means I do accept it. I'm not outraged that this happened, but I'm very sad that I lost a relationship. I feel lonely now. In English, they're both included in the word grief, but I want to separate these two. There's outrage and acceptance, there's emptiness and loss. I'll tell you what Judaism says before we explore it. All right, I'll tell you the end before we begin the Judaism's mourning is all about mourning and mentally and emotionally processing the emptiness and the loss. But in the Jewish model, outrage and unacceptance is wrong and it's not healthy. And we're going to explore that right now. The what and the why, but let's start, that's on one foot, the Jewish model. But let us now do some reading to get a Jewish understanding of how Judaism thinks, how Judaism wants us to think, right? The how happiness thinks of even mourning and loss and grief. Let's turn back to text number 1. Text number 1 is a text from the Midrash, and it tells us a very interesting story about a notorious, not in the negative form, right? I used to think the word notorious only means negative. But then, right, Max, am I right? But notorious could also just mean like infamous,
Yeah.
or like famous, right? Let's turn back to page 157. And has anybody here ever heard about the Talmudic figure named Beruria? She was a female, Beruria. In recent times, she's been getting a lot more attention. Beruria was the wife of the great sage Rabbi Meir, who's one of the most important sages in the Talmud. And she had the brains and the wisdom to outmatch him. And she's quoted, her opinions are quoted a lot in the Talmud, her wisdom, and sometimes her opinions is actually taken as the final verdict. So in that sense, she's even like a sage, which is a very powerful idea. There's even a story where all the sages unanimously agreed on a certain position, and she, a singular lone female voice, argued with them, and she ultimately prevailed, which is an unbelievable idea that in an environment, in a culture, we're talking about over 1,500 years ago, You know, that a woman should actually be given that sense of, it's very powerful. So Bruria Rebbe Meir, not only was he a great sage, but she as well was, which again was unique. Even today, it's unique. Okay, I don't know, whatever. This will have to be off the record. It's not such a nice story, but it's a cute story. You want to hear a story? There was a chief rabbi of, I believe, Montreal, Canada, in the second half of the 20th century, the late 1900s. I believe he passed away in the late 1900s. Chief rabbi, he was a chief dayan, the chief judge, he was a brilliant Torah scholar. His name was Rabbi Pinchas Hirschsprung. Okay, he was a great rabbi in Canada, Montreal, Canada. And he had, which is also interesting, we just had it in the news today and yesterday. I don't know if you guys know what I'm talking about. Cultural references. He had a very notorious Jewish nose. Okay, he had a Jewish nose. If you don't know what a Jewish nose is, go ask a Nazi, right? But it was a Jewish nose what that man had. Okay, it was a very, very strong, large, robust nose, very healthy. Okay. He once said in his old age, he once had a line. Not a nice line. Okay, I'm not advocating that it was nice, but it's a funny line. He said, "I was hoping that my children would get my head and my wife's nose. Instead, they got my nose and my wife's head." None of them inherited the brains from his father. Okay. I hope no Hirschsprungs are gonna. No Hirschsprungs in this class over here. Okay, not offending anybody. So okay, but Bruria was a serious rival, was a real match for Rabbi Meir. In short, okay, that's a little bit of a digression. This is a little anecdote told to us by the sages, recorded in the Midrash, of Rabbi Meir and Bruria. Toby, please read for us text 1 on page 157.
It happened that one Shabbat afternoon, while Rabbi Meir was lecturing at the study hall, his 2 sons died. What did their mother, Bruria, do? She laid them on the bed and covered them with a sheet. After Shabbat, Rabbi Meir arrived from the study hall and said to her, "Where are my 2 sons?" She said to him, "They went to the study hall." Said he to her, "But I looked in the study hall and I did not see them." She handed him a cup of wine for Havdalah. After reciting Havdalah, he again asked, "Where are my 2 sons?" Said she to him, "They went to a particular place and will soon return." She served him dinner. After he recited the grace after meal, she said, "My teacher, I have a question to ask." Said he to her, "Ask." She said to him, "Before today, someone left an item with me for safekeeping, and he has now come to collect it. Shall we return the item or not?" Said he to her, "My daughter, it is not a custodian required to return the deposit to its master?" Said she to him, "My teacher, if not for your words, I could not have brought myself to return it." What did she do next? She grasped his hand and led him up to that room, brought him near the bed, removed the sheet from over them, and he saw the 2 of them lying dead upon the bed. He began to weep, saying, my children, my teachers, meaning my children in the natural sense, and my teachers who enlightened my eyes with the words of Torah." At that moment she said to him, "Rabbi Meir, my teacher, did not tell me that we are required to return the deposit to its master. God has given and God has taken." With these words she consoled him, and his mind was eased and settled.
Very powerful story. And how she's setting him up to have the right attitude. So here we're having an attitude teaching, right? How happiness thinks. How Bruria, this great sage in her own right, a female sage, is helping her husband to accept, right? And she even says herself, "My teacher," right? "If not for your words, I cannot have brought myself to return it." Let's unpack what's happening over here. Very, very powerful text. There's a few key ideas that are happening over here, and this forms the basis of what Judaism wants her mourning to look like. Number 1, Bruria, the wife, is setting up the attitude. She speaks about the life of her 2 sons as alone, a gift, a temporary gift, a custodian. We have a deposit, and the owner is coming back for it, asking for it, and we have to give it back. And we have to give it back. God has given and God has taken. She's created this environment of mourning, but within a sense of acceptance, within a sense of justice. That's the first very big attitude we're seeing over here. What we also see is Rabbi Meir right away starts crying. He begins weeping. But what does he do? He starts saying, my children, and he right away speaks about their qualities. He says, my teachers, meaning these were both his children and his students. He taught his children Torah. And in Judaism, we have the beautiful teaching that the greatest teacher in life is who? Our students. A teacher learns most from teaching. A teacher learns most from students. So he right away extols them. He right away speaks about the virtues. He says, these are my teachers, the ones who taught me Torah. And let me just put this up over here. This is how Bruria is right away within this text seeing these beautiful Jewish values of how we approach the process of mourning and grief. So Rabbi Meir, his response is right away weeping. He's right away getting into releasing the emotion, and he right away extols his children's virtues. Bruria, what she is doing here, she's right away reframing the death with this parable of a deposit. And the advantages, or what's happening over here is, and I want to point out to you, is that in Rabbi Meir's response, number one, he's actively grieving, which we're going to see is a very big part of the Jewish process of mourning. And he's speaking about the enduring soul qualities. He's not focusing on death, but he's celebrating their life. Even within the environment of mourning and weeping, but he's speaking about their qualities. And what Beruria is doing, she's creating this acceptance. That yes, we are very sad, we're going to mourn, we're going to cry, but within this mental framework of accepting that this is what God has done, it's even justice, right? Is not a custodian required to return the deposit to its master? This was just, this was appropriate. God has wanted them back. God has given, God has taken. She's quoting this verse from Job, and this is what we're seeing over here. Let's now look. I want to read the actual full, we have here a verse from Job that Bruria quotes. I want to read the whole verse in context. Job is one of the books of the Tanakh from the Bible. And the theme of Job is the character. In Hebrew, it's Eov. And he is facing tremendous loss. He lost all of his children, I believe. Almost all of his children. And the whole book of Job deals with the struggle of going through such pain and loss and trauma and the philosophical questions. But this is chapter 1 of Job. Let's read it. Larry, text 2 on page 159.
Now the day came that Job's sons and daughters were dining and drinking wine at the home of their firstborn brother. A messenger came to Job and said, the cattle were plowing and the she-donkeys were grazing beside them. And Sheba fell upon them and took them, and they smote their youths by the sword. And only I alone escaped to tell you. This one was still talking, and another one came and said, a tremendous fire fell from heaven and burned the flocks and the youths and consumed them. And I alone escaped to tell you. This one was still talking, and another one came and said, Chaldeans formed 3 bands, overran the camels, and took them, and smote the youths with a sword, and only I alone escaped to tell you. While this one was still talking, another one came and said, your sons and daughters were dining and drinking wine at the home of their firstborn brother. And behold, a great wind came from the other side of the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It fell upon the youths who died, and only I alone escaped to tell you. Job stood up and rent his robe and tore his hair, and he fell to the ground and prostrated himself. And he said, naked I emerged from my mother's womb, and naked I will return there. God has given, and God has taken. Blessed be the name of God.
Okay, so Job is getting faced one day. He has a beautiful life. He was very wealthy. He had a beautiful family, and all of a sudden, on one day, it all falls apart. Child after child is dead, is killed. How does he react? He right away tears his clothing, says he tears his hair, which, by the way, is not a Jewish thing, okay? And he right away falls to the ground, and he right away frames or reframes his grievance. What does he say? He gives himself an attitude. Naked I emerged from my mother's womb, and naked I will return there. God has given, God has taken. Blessed be the name of God. This is exactly the same idea. A sense of acceptance. What he's saying is, let's think about what he's saying. A lot of times, especially when death happens, we can't help but think a certain sense of something that was mine was robbed from me. And this is especially true when there was a tragic death. This wasn't meant to be. This was wrong. Maybe somebody else caused it. Somebody else ruined my life. We feel cheated out of life. This shouldn't have happened. It was unjust. But Job is saying, no. Having that attitude of unacceptance is a certain form of entitlement. You know, who said you were meant to have this? Who said it's yours that somebody's taking away from you? He's saying, naked I emerged. Really, every moment of life is a gift. I have nothing more than a bare back. Any gift of life that I have, every moment of life, the clothing on my back, the wealth that I have, the relationships that I have, every single one of them is a gift from God. I don't deserve it. I'm not entitled to them. Every moment that I have it is a gift. But when I lose it, it was never mine to begin with. It was a gift in the first place. It's like the attitude of somebody getting $1 million and then complaining, oh, why did you give me $2 million? So it's all, he says, okay, so I got these many years with my children. That was a gift from God. And what does he right away say? God has given and God has taken. This was God's call. I don't like it. I'm very pained by it. I would never have called this shot. I don't think their lives should have ended now. But this was God's thing. God gave it to me. I have nothing more than my naked body. Beyond that, God has given, God has taken. Blessed be the name of God. He is recognizing this was God's act of justice. That's what it is. And here we get the idea that what Judaism wants us to have, Judaism does not feel it is healthy to have an attitude of a non-acceptance and outrage, of a sense that this was unjust. Rather, we should mourn, but within this sense of this is what God did, this was God's call, God's shot. And as painful as it is, we accept that this is the reality and that this was meant to be. God has given, God has taken. Job gives us the analogy that every moment of life is a gift from God, like a temporary gift. So every moment, whatever blessings we have in that moment of life, that's what God has. We can never feel entitled to it. And by the way, one of the areas where we could see that it's all a subjective perspective. When somebody dies at 125 years old, no one's, of course, it's a sad thing, the family, but, it's good, we're happy he lived a good long life, he was anyway suffering, we're happy he died, like these types of things. But if somebody, but at 40, that's a tragedy. So it's anyways all subjective. It's all about how you think about it. The non-acceptance comes when you think you should have had more. It's a certain sense of entitlement. I was supposed to have more. This was cut short. Versus saying, no, this is no cut short. This is exactly how many years God needed this soul to be here on earth, whatever their purpose was, whatever their mission was. And it's painful to say goodbye, but this is the right thing. This is God's shot right now. So Job puts it in the terms of a gift. Beruria even says it, she gives it a little bit further. She says every moment of life, every gift of life is like a trust from God. We never even owned it in the first place. God could always come back and say, I'm the master. I want this gift back. I want this deposit back. And our job was to take good care of it while it was in our hands and to make sure it doesn't depreciate in value. It only goes up in value. And if we did that well, then there should even be a sense of comfort that we're able to give back our, to give back this deposit faithfully. These two texts form the basis of the Jewish response to dealing with the loss. In Judaism, what is the very first step? We spoke about the act of tearing, kriya, which happens at the beginning of the funeral. But the very first step, what is the very first step of mourning? Literally the first thing. God forbid somebody hears, none of us should have to deal with it. But somebody here hears about the loss of life, of a loved one. What do you right away do?
Tearing.
No, tearing happens later. What's the first thing?
A blessing,
A blessing.
like
Baruch Dayan Ha'emet. We say a blessing. Take a look on page 161. What do we say? There's a blessing. And Judaism is a blessing for everything, right? There's like some jokes about that. Blessing for everything. We don't do anything without saying a blessing. We don't get married without saying a blessing, all right? Everything has a blessing. Text 3a, we say, Baruch Dayan Ha'emet. Blessed is the true judge. What are we doing here? It's a funny statement. Blessed is the true judge. Well, we're saying it's an affirmation. Right away, we're faced with a terrible loss, terrible tragedy. We say, the true judge called this shot. I'm pained by it. I'm sad about it. I would have not liked that this should happen. But God gave, God took. This is an act of God, and there's no injustice. I accept it. This was God's proper, good, and fair, and just call. Right? I don't understand it. I don't like it, but He knows how to run the world. He's doing it. And that is also what is the message of the very opening phrase of the Kaddish. Take a look at text 3b. How does Kaddish begin? The mourner's Kaddish. Yiskadal v'yiskadash mei rabbah bi'alma divra chirusei. Which means, may the great name of God be exalted and sanctified in the world that He created according to His will. Again, it's affirming that, even in this moment of pain, it's God's world. He created it. He's running it. And it's all according to His will. There's no mistakes. There's no injustice. And no matter how difficult the tragedy is, this is God's call. This is God's just shot. These are the two ideas. The blessing, blessed true judge. There is no injustice in God's world. There are no accidents. This was an act from the true judge. A call from the true judge. And the Kaddish, all that occurs in the world is solely by God's just will. And in that sense, we're going to learn more about the actual mourning practices and how they're being done in the right frame of mind. But Judaism says non-acceptance is not healthy, it's not Jewish. There has to be immediate acceptance, although it's of course very difficult. We're all human. We're all human, especially if it's a tragedy. In what we perceive as an untimely death, our immediate reaction is to feel that we were cheated out of life, cheated out of a relationship. But this is a personal journey, to make a personal effort and to use the tools that the Torah gives us to be able to get ourselves in the right frame of mind of acceptance. This is what God wanted. It's His world. He's the true judge. He's running it according to His will. And the whole mourning process has to be from this perspective of acceptance and not an outrage that something went wrong. This was right. It's terribly sad. We're going to mourn it. Torah says you got to mourn it. But from this perspective. Okay, before we go further into the Jewish model, I want to turn to page 168 now. We're doing a little bit of skipping around, just to make sure you don't fall asleep here. All right? Okay, page 168. I want to revisit now the Kubler-Ross model. Let's look at denial, anger, and depression, right, which are the three stages that we've been focusing on. Which one of these are expressions of outrage and non-acceptance? Which one of these are expressions of emptiness and loss? All right, think about it. And then I want to ask you for your opinion on these. Okay, let's hear your opinion. Denial. Does denial come from outrage and unacceptance, or does it come from mourning the emptiness and the loss? Outrage. Denial is a form of outrage, right? I can't believe this happened. This shouldn't have happened. This can't happen. It's wrong that it happened. That's all an expression of denial. Acceptance is the very opposite of denial. It's embracing the situation. It's saying this was meant to be. So denial, outrage, and acceptance. What about anger? Is anger outrage and non-acceptance, or is it emptiness and loss?
Outrage.
Again, right? Anger is a form of non-acceptance. I'm angry. This shouldn't have happened. Depression. Does that stem from outrage and non-acceptance, or emptiness and loss? Emptiness and loss? Oh. Depression is a little bit of a toss-up, right? It could come from a sense of outrage, but it could also come from just the emptiness. It's just a depression from the emptiness of the relationship. But it's either or. What we see over here is that the Kubler-Ross model is much more focused on outrage and non-acceptance as the process of grief versus the Jewish model, which is going to be all about emptiness and loss. In Judaism, grieving and mourning should never be about outrage and non-acceptance. Because what's denial? Denial means I'm not accepting what's happening. This shouldn't have happened. This is wrong. It's unjust. It can't be. It shouldn't be. That's also anger, right? First is denial, and then when you start accepting the reality, then you become angry. Which is, again, this shouldn't have happened. I will not accept it. Whoever did it robbed me of my life. Depression, right? Either or again. But it could come from a sense of I just cannot accept the situation. So my life cannot continue, right? It's a form of running away from the reality, and even more than running away from the reality, it's a form of saying, I cannot accept this reality. So what do I go into? I just go into this bottomless pit, this endless grief, chronic grief. It's a very big problem. There are certain people that just, their lives turn into a chronic grief. They can't get themselves off the couch. They can't take care of themselves. They don't start living a life. I'll tell you a personal story, okay? Mushki's grandfather, great-grandfather, Mushki's great-grandparents, he lost his wife relatively very young. It was some tragic death, and he just he was a very vibrant person, but he just couldn't allow himself to ever get remarried. He said, "My life is over. And the Rebbe was very strong with him. You need to get remarried. It's not healthy. And the Rebbe told him, your wife in heaven wants to see you happy. Your wife wants to see you moving on in life. He said, I can't do it. I can't do it to my wife. I loved her too much. I can't imagine living with another woman. The Rebbe said, your wife wants you to live on. Your wife is pained that you are not getting over your own grief. Very powerful. He ended up not getting remarried. He just couldn't do it. But the Rebbe really pushed him. He says, you have to do it for the sake of your children, for your sake. Okay. You can't, it becomes a paralyzing grief. It becomes this perpetual form of life for years and years and years of depression that you can't accept it. You don't say, blessed is the true judge. It's easy for me to preach from the pulpit. But this is what Judaism says. Acceptance means that you understand how to mourn and still continue on. So what we're seeing over here, Judaism is the Kubler-Ross model is very focused on outrage and non-acceptance. Judaism focuses and teaches that's not appropriate, it's not healthy. It's not a way to move on. If you're focused on outrage and non-acceptance, you have denial, anger, depression. These are not good things. We'll talk about that soon. But emptiness and loss is appropriate, and that is healthy mourning. And we're going to learn more about the process in a moment. One more little point is the idea that Judaism does not want us to mourn excessively. So first of all, we already see now why mourning excessively is not good. Why? Mourning excessively is usually a sign that you're not accepting the situation. You're getting stuck. You're getting too emotional, too angry, too this. There's also the idea that mourning has to be done with a proper understanding of what it means that a soul died. What does that mean? And I want to read with you a beautiful, beautiful text. Which discusses the idea of not excessive mourning. One of the areas of not excessive mourning, so number one, we learned don't do Shiva more longer than appropriate, right? There's also the idea, which is a biblical commandment, a prohibition. Well, I'll read it with you. In ancient times, in pagan times, this was a practice of mourning. We're turning back to page 162. All right, let me give you a moment. Page 162. This is from Deuteronomy, text 4a. Are we all there? It says, "You are children of God. You shall not gash yourselves, nor shall you make any baldness between your eyes for the dead." Which means in pagan times, when you heard about death, what you do is you gash yourself. You would literally self-harm, cut yourself as a form of grief. And they would tear out here from the front of their head. Literally pull out a whole fist of hair. The Torah says Jews don't do that. Okay. I want to read this next text with you. Beautiful text. From the book called Ikarim, which means fundamentals, one of the most important works of Jewish philosophy, Rabbi Yosef Albo. He asks a very simple question. He looks at this verse and says, "You are children of God, you shall not gash yourselves." Well, what's the juxtaposition over here? Yeah, it's very nice to say you're children of God. How is that the introduction to this commandment? What does "you shall not gash yourselves" have to do with being children of God? See, he explains that no, the juxtaposition is teaches us the meaning of the commandment. Let's read text 4b. Where are we holding? Elki, where about you? Text 4b, page 163.
On the face of it, it would seem that the very opposite is the case, that this would be a reason to be pained and to mourn excessively over a death. Indeed, the death of a child of a king would be more cause for mourning than that of an ordinary person. Imagine that a person says to his friend, "Don't feel so bad about that ring you lost, because it had a precious gem set in it." The meaning of the verse is as follows: "Because you are children of God and a holy and treasured people, it is not fitting that you mourn a death excessively, for that would indicate that you believe that the deceased is hopelessly gone, and you are therefore mourning him as you would an earthen pot that was shattered beyond repair. But it is not so in the case of a death. Rather, it is like a gold or silver vessel that was broken, which can be repaired. For the soul enters into the treasure house of God. Therefore, there is no cause to be excessively pained over this, only as a person would be pained over his friend's parting from him to travel to a distant place to gain much wealth by commerce. There should be no doubt that the soul, being holy, will be joined with the holy angels on high. In this way, the Torah indicates that the soul endures after death."
Very powerful text. This is another layer of the Jewish way of mourning. A very big part of this deep grief and depression is a sense of finality. It's over, right? This life is gone. It evaporated into thin air. Right? We had a life here, a vibrant life, a person with feelings, emotions, excitement, the whole life. And now what's with that life? It doesn't exist anymore. And that can be very, very painful. And that also creates the sense of it's over, right? I lost it. It's all gone. Judaism wants us to mourn, but within the context that we're mourning the emptiness and the loss. What are we mourning? We're not mourning that this person is gone and disappeared. We're mourning the sense that our physical relationship has now, we lost on that. But the life, the soul, is still alive. And that's a key Jewish belief. There's body and soul. We spoke about that last week. Death does not mean the end of life. It only means the end of this life in this body. But the soul lives on and continues life on a more spiritual level. This text says excessive mourning is very unhealthy because it means that we're not appreciating that even though we're mourning the emptiness and the loss and the loneliness, the soul is still alive, right? Don't give up hope on it. I'm still here, still alive, right? And not only that, it's living a beautiful life. And we have to appreciate that. We have to celebrate this life because the life is not gone. He says beautiful words over here, right? We're the children of God. So when the soul goes up on high, we can be sure the soul's entering the treasure house of God. It's joined with the holy angels on high, with the holy souls on high. The Torah wants us to recognize this and to never lose sight of the celebration of this life, because yes, the physical relationship is gone, and that is something that the soul is pained about as well. The soul experiences pain as well. But in a certain sense, life continues for that soul, and there's even a very strong pleasure to that life. We all know this. There's physical pleasure and there's spiritual pleasure. So what's physical pleasure? I don't know, eating a good piece of steak, right? Eat a good hamburger fresh off the grill. Oh, made just right. That's a good physical pleasure. What's spiritual pleasure? Which is beyond the physical, right? Beyond pleasure from the body. This is already soul stimulus. A deep friendship, the pleasure of friendship, the pleasure of studying, where we sense, oh, that's a spiritual pleasure. We all know that spiritual pleasures are much deeper, are much more powerful, are much more real than physical pleasures. Right? Physical pleasures are very pleasurable, but 5 minutes later it's history, right? 5 minutes later it's yesterday's rotten lunch. Spiritual pleasures are very deep, very meaningful. They last with us for life. The soul loses physical life. Spiritual life, it continues in an even stronger measure than before. So in that sense, we have to always keep the mourning within a context that the life doesn't die, the life continues. And we have to be comforted by that knowledge, that we are mourning the emptiness and the loneliness. We are not mourning the finality of this life, which is also why Judaism wants us to take very good care of the body. Right? No cremation. Cremation is an act of saying, it's all gone. Let's just burn it, destroy it. Right? Like they say a story. A rabbi once went to a dying woman, and she says, I want to be cremated. The rabbi says, forbid, we can't cremate. She said, we have to cremate. She's so adamant. He says, why? Why are you so adamant in cremation? He says, I'll tell you why. I want you to take my cremated ashes, walk into Macy's, and just sprinkle it all around Macy's. Macy's? What's the matter with you? She says, like this, my daughter will still visit me. Okay. Okay. Here's the idea. Right? The whole mourning has to be done in a way of acceptance. And we're actively mourning the loneliness and the loss of the physical relationship and the pain of that loss. But not in a sense where it's excessive, where it's unhealthy, and where we always recognize that the grief is, that the life continues. And with all this background, we're starting to run a little bit out of time, but this is important. And just, dear friends, for those of you on Zoom, we're probably going to have that problem again of 9 o'clock, but I turned on my mobile hotspot. So if there's a lag, don't run away, okay? Because hopefully we'll get the Zoom right back on internet when we switch over to new Wi-Fi, okay? So I want to keep you on board over here. Now I want to turn to the Jewish model, to the actual rituals of Jewish mourning, which we learned about earlier. And now I want to re-examine them from the perspective of what we learned about the Jewish attitudes. And what we're going to see, and this is very interesting because studies have been done more recently of the psychological benefits of the Jewish process of avelut, of mourning, Jewish mourning. And how Jewish mourning is designed in such a way that it helps us go through mourning in a healthy way, in a productive way, with the right attitudes, which is very, very powerful. And I want to do this together with you. Of course, Jewish mourning rituals weren't given to us with modern psychology in mind, right? They were given to us because this is how God wants us to react. But today we look back and analyze them from a psychological perspective, and we actually realize how much wisdom there is in God's code of conduct, even by mourning. So, okay, let's just go through this. The fundamental beliefs in Judaism, the eternity of the soul. We believe that the spiritual self lives on and is not diminished at all by death. And death, in fact, frees the soul from the limitations and constraints of the physical state, allowing for even deeper spiritual life. And for this reason, by mourning, we also have to celebrate the life of this person. Okay. Let us now return, and we'll come full circle. We'll see how all these attitudes are reflected in Judaism. The psychological benefits of avelut. The first idea is ripping. Is ripping the garment. That marks the onset of active mourning. What is the on a psychological level? What do you think? What is the purpose? Why is it beneficial for a mourner to?
Maybe because the person has been ripped away from you.
Oh, so you're saying that it has a symbolism, that my heart is torn, the person torn away. That symbolism. I'm asking from a psychological perspective. How is it helpful for the person? How is it healthy? What's the psychological benefit over here to have your to make a tear.
Because there's a flaw on the person, which represents the death of.
This is symbolism again. I'm saying a psychological health, like a mental health, psychological benefit. I'll tell you. What is the very easy first reaction that a person has when they hear of a devastating loss? What was the first step in Kubler-Ross's model? Denial. It's very painful to deal with. Denial in the moment may seem good. It's not healthy. The worst thing to see at a funeral, especially when they're young children, is the lack of emotion. That's horrible. It's very unhealthy. That means they're bottling it all in. That means they're not processing it. And what that means is that all this pressure is only building up, and it's only going to get worse. And Judaism and psychology says it's so important that you begin the mourning and the grieving process. And for this reason, the idea that you have to go and recognize the pain, which means you can't just run away in your hole, in your cocoon, and forget about it and try to distract yourself. But you have to go and do such a clear, visceral act of ripping the clothing. And for many people, this is what helps them emotionally feel the pain, recognize the pain, and just start allowing those emotions to live and come to the surface. And for that reason, it's very, very healthy. Kriya counteracts denial with a tangible physical expression of the loss. And what it does is it propels the onset of the mourning process for those who are perhaps too numb to feel yet. And this way you see, for many people, when you see the tear, it hits home then. And it allows them to really enter active mourning, which is so, so important. The next phase, we have Shiva. What's the purpose of Shiva? What do you say? What are the psychological benefits of Shiva? 7 days of mourning. What was that? Number one, we have community. Number one, you're not alone. It's a very vulnerable time. It's a time when people could fall into depression. So what does Judaism say? No. This will be a time of support, of friendship, community. And by the way, according to Jewish law, visiting a Shiva home, it's not done so properly. Today, you go into a Shiva home, you could think that you walked into like a bachelor's party or something. I don't know, man, it's just a Super Bowl party. Everybody's there, everybody's in makeup, everybody's running around, they're talking. The person who's mourning is running around, taking care of everybody and socializing. According to Judaism, the mourners have to sit the entire time. Have to sit a little bit lower than the usual level of sitting as an act of mourning. And the community, the friends and family that come, you don't initiate talking. The initiator has to be the mourner, which means let them define what they want to talk about, if they want to talk. But simply be there. And the idea is to speak about the qualities, good memories, things that we can learn from of the deceased. Celebrate the life. And that's cathartic, that's helpful. That's helping the mourner mourn and grieve instead of running around doing a Shiva, which turns into an event, instead of a healthy healthy part of mourning and grieving.
I found that hearing good things about the person and good stories about them diffuse anger too.
Oh.
Because it's much easier to think of the person's life as a gift.
When you realize all the good memories, all the good
Right,
times.
particularly an elderly person, but when you hear all of the good things and the positive stories that they brought.
Right. Oh, that's right. My little thing is whenever I go to a Shiva home, I always ask them, tell me a little bit about your mom. Tell me about your dad. And what's amazing is that I too often see they're caught off guard. Like, what, you really want to hear about everybody else just coming in and kibitzing and socializing. This is a chance for you to talk to me. I want to hear about tell me some good memories. Tell me what your dad taught you. It's a very special thing to give that gift of helping this person this difficult time to celebrate this life. And in a way where the mourning is helpful, is healthy, it's cathartic, and it helps them. That's called active mourning. Okay, what else? We have community and the idea of celebrating life. What else is there in Shiva as a psychological benefit?
There's food.
What was that, Leah?
Oh, I'm sorry, I said there's food.
Food? Okay, that's not very, yeah, I
Well,
guess it's,
the person needs nourishment, right? You want
oh,
them
okay,
to
so at
eat.
least people are gonna bring him food or her food, yeah.
No, I think she's.
That is
I
true.
think she's absolutely right. You can't collapse into a depression.
Right,
And not get fat. At least you're getting fat.
right. And you can't worry about making your own meals at that point.
Right.
Right, so you have food.
Somebody's giving you something.
That's part of community. That's actually, you're right. I'll tell you also, the idea, especially today, in today's society, it's expected to get over it very quickly. Today, the next day, they're back in the office. 2 days later, right? Yeah, whatever. I had a half a day shiva. And, what can I do? I'm back in the office. It's a form of denial. It's a form of escaping the mourning. And Judaism says mourning is a mitzvah. It's healthy. You need to mourn. You can't rush this. Don't say I'm over it. Don't bottle it up. Mourn. Give yourself the time to mourn. You need to mourn. Unfortunately, if mourning doesn't done properly, sometimes depression kicks in later. Because you didn't help yourself process this loss in a healthy way. So Judaism says mourning, the Shiva, is all about creating a space, a forced space, to grieve and heal. Shiva is all about, the next thing is, it prevents the mourning from becoming lonely. This is a very vulnerable time for people. This is when they could fall into depression and anger and all other negative forms of mourning and grieving. This is creating a healthy place where community comes, and the week is spent discussing the life and achievements of the departed. We're celebrating this life. It's being done in a healthy way. That's very, very important. Are you writing it down? Should I keep it up over here, Toby? Yeah. Okay. Okay, let's go on to the next thing. Okay, we're going to go a few minutes over, all right? What's the next step? By the way, this is all on page 170, if you want to check it out. All these 4 questions, I apologize. All on page 170. We're up to question, I'm sorry. No, sorry. 169. 169. Page 169. Question number 3. What is achieved by making mourning a phased process with preset milestones? The whole process is canned. 3 days, 7 days, 30 days. Doesn't everyone mourn differently in his or her own way? What's the idea that, 7 days and you have to get up? Even within Shiva, the first 3 days, Jewish law says this is a time of very emotional mourning. It's a time to cry. After the first 3 days, you're not supposed to cry as much. Which means it's still active mourning. There's still a lot of pain, but that overwhelmingness, that uncontrollable sobbing and the deep raw pain, Jewish law says only 3 days. So what's this thing? Everything is canned. What if my shiva is only 5 days? I don't need more. I don't need 7 days. What if somebody says I need a shiva that's 2 weeks? Why is Judaism forcing it on this tight schedule? What do you say?
I think the structure.
Is the internet still on? It's 9 o'clock now. Val, you're on. Oh, look at that. We're on. Nope. Houston, no problems. Okay. What was that? I'm sorry.
I think Judaism dictates or imposes a structure, milestones, if you will, in the mourning process.
Why? What's the psychological benefit?
Well, because you have maybe a subconscious expectation that after X days, or 30 days, and the rest, I'll start to feel better.
What it creates is, again, one of the biggest problems is called chronic grieving. Chronic grievance. Where somebody starts grieving and is in a sad place, in a bad place, and they just cannot get over it. And all of a sudden it's a month and 2 months and a year and 2 years, and it's a form of depression. I'm mourning, what can I do? I'm still sad. Judaism, by on the one hand, forcing us to mourn, right? Mourn. We have a shiva. Don't rush it. Don't run back to the office. You're not allowed to work now. Make sure that you're allowing yourself to heal. But then also pushing you on a healthy journey. This is very, very healthy, and this is what Judaism wants us to have. That we should be on a forward-moving track, so that we don't get stuck. And this is very much what Judaism wants from us. Let's put the next step over here. That mourning should be a phased process that transforms grieving into an active, forward-moving process. We're mourning. It's a process to get through, but it has to be done in this sense. Leah, you had a question?
Well, I just want to say, isn't 7 considered a complete number too?
Okay, that's a separate thing, right? The symbolism of it we'll get to another time. But yeah. Okay. The milestones, as you just said, the milestones impel the mourner to move on to the next phase of mourning. It helps us sometimes, even when it's difficult. We have We have to get back. Somebody said this morning something very interesting. She said she could relate to the importance of the shloshim, the first month. Because she said, there's this expectation. In today's society, there's an expectation. Already a week later, go put on makeup, go out on social events, go to a wedding, go to a bar mitzvah. She's like, maybe I'm not in the position yet. It's the fact that Judaism forces it upon you. Don't do it. Let yourself mourn. Give yourself that space. It's unhealthy when we rush it and we can it and it's too. But at the same time, there is a step where we have to say, the Shiva is over. The Shloshim is over. And then there's the first yard site. Okay, it's time, there's a healthy phase of mourning, of moving on. Okay, last step over here. What is the idea of mandatory mourning? It's a little bit similar. Let's read the question over here. What is achieved by making mourning mandatory for the mourner, whether she feels like mourning or not? Why does it have to be mandatory? And once again, the idea that we're forcing. Denial is not an option. You must mourn. You can't push it off. You can't shorten it. So we're moving it along. It's a phased process. It's mandatory. And it's very, very healthy. So dear friends, this is what we see. The Jewish model. All right, let's put this up over here. Mandatory mourning combats denial and places the mourner to be on track to heal. And this is how we see over here, that these steps over here. Oh, okay, sorry. The last step over here is we'll put a few more. Mandatory mourning is also, Jewish law told us, it's cruel to not mourn, right? It's cruel. Mourning is a form of showing appreciation for life, of valuing the life. A life lost is less godliness in this world. Every human being is created in the image of God. We have to appreciate what's happening over here. We have to recognize the loss of life. It's cruel to not mourn. So forget about the health for us. Mourning is important, showing that we appreciated the life that we had, and cutting it short is even a form of cruelty, and we don't have time to talk about this, but it even benefits the departed soul. It's helpful for the soul as well. Death is painful for the soul as well. The same way we feel the sense of loneliness and the loss of the close relationship, the soul also lost on that. And even though it still has a life to live and it's going to be a good life, it's going to continue on and have whatever life looks like up there, but that separation even from the body, even the soul separating from the body, is very difficult for the soul. And Shiva is comforting the soul as well. Our sages tell us the soul, before it goes up on high, it lingers around the Shiva home. The spirit, that soul spiritually is there by the Shiva home. And when people come, they're not only comforting the mourner, they're comforting the soul as well. Okay. Dear friends, I want to conclude with one final thought. I know we're going over time. One quick final thought. What we see over here is that Judaism differs greatly in what should be the ideal grieving journey. According to Kubler-Ross, more or less every single person is going to be going through denial, anger. We had the third one, which wasn't so as relevant, which was bargaining. And then we had depression. And then finally, according to the psychological model, acceptance. So Judaism says, no, none of those emotions are healthy. All of them are avoidable. There has to be healthy acceptance. That's number one. There has to be acceptance. There has to be active mourning. We have to recognize our loss. It has to be focused on the loneliness and the loss of this physical relationship. And still an appreciation for the life, that the life lives on, and celebrating the life, and that's part of the mourning process. And then we have acceptance. Right? We accept the relationship. We come back to, as I said, equilibrium. Life resumes as normal. That's the goal in grieving, right? Judaism says, no, we also disagree with that. In the psychological model, we want you to get back to health. You know what Judaism says? No. Let's read this next text. Last text, page 172. I'm really keeping you here on your toes with this page turning over here. Okay, page 172. Text 9, beautiful, beautiful text. Carrie, where are we? Did you read? You read, Elkie. So Carrie, where about you? Text 9, here we go.
The whole of creation is a descent and a downward evolution from above to below. The divine intention being that this should lead to an elevation after elevation. The same applies to death and mourning, for the departed as well as for the mourners. There's
a rule in spiritual physics. Every descent is for the purpose of a greater ascent. Every time we go down, it's really for the purpose of greater energy to go even higher. And this is the idea, right? Like a roller coaster. You're only going down, it's like that you get all this good energy to be able to do all these exciting things afterwards. You couldn't do it unless you had this big drop. In spirituality, this is a cardinal rule of spiritual physics. Every time there's a downtime, there's a descent in our lives, it's always for a greater ascent. Not only for us, it's for the soul that departed and for the mourners. So the psychological model concludes with acceptance. Back to healthy level. Judaism says, no, we're not going for just back to normal. We're going for even greater. And this is an idea that Judaism speaks about, and only recently, positive psychology is starting to recognize as well. There's something called post-traumatic growth. That people change for the better, not despite, but specifically because of a certain traumatic, because of a very painful experience. And this is the final idea of how happiness thinks. That despite the mourning and the difficulty, Judaism says this is a great opportunity, and this is designed as a way for in our journey to grow and become better people. And in that sense, even the last step, Judaism says is not just acceptance, but growth, a better you, because of this painful period. Dear friends, I want to show you a video, and then we'll wrap up. Okay? This one says, mourning brings elevation for both the departed soul and for the mourner, and the goal is to emerge from the mourning process, in a better place than we were even before the descent. Okay, here we go.
After the loss of a loved one might think that the best case scenario for recovery is that the person resumes the life they had before in a way that is as close to normal as possible. However, Richard Tedeschi, a psychologist at the University of North Carolina, has identified an amazing phenomenon whereby a traumatic event impels a person to a better place, better intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. He named this phenomenon post-traumatic growth and encountered it when interviewing people who had survived severe injuries and older people who had lost their spouses. Many people told him the same thing. They wished deeply that they had not lost a spouse or been paralyzed, but nonetheless, the experience changed them for the better. A recent New York Times article chronicled this phenomenon in the context of soldiers in war. In 2005, while deployed in Iraq, Sergeant Jeffrey Beltran's Humvee was hit by a bomb. The blast broke Beltran's knee and leg, fractured his lower spine, and buried shrapnel in his thigh. He underwent 14 operations over the next year and experienced anger, mood swings, physical and psychological pain. In 2007, Beltran served in Afghanistan, where he witnessed the many traumas of war, including the death of a close friend. After 6 months in Afghanistan, Beltran was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Over time, though, Beltran began noticing surprising changes. Before the bomb blast, he was a drifter and spent much of his free time playing video games. He was more concerned with figuring out how to cope from one deployment to the next than with finding direction. He is different now. The bombing, the post-traumatic stress, and the challenges he faced changed him. But he feels he has changed for the better. Beltran says, "This whole experience has helped me to be more open, more flexible. I am branching out to activities that I was once uncomfortable with." Beltran is actively pursuing a promotion. He's taking online courses toward a bachelor's degree in criminal justice. And he's also discovered a sense of spirituality. According to Tedeschi, only a seismic event, not just an upsetting experience, can lead to this kind of growth. People show positive changes in 5 areas of life. They experience more personal strength, have a renewed appreciation for life. Their relationships improve. They discover new goals and possibilities. and they feel spiritually more connected. Post-traumatic change does not usually occur in one transcendent moment, but over years of searching. That was the case for Sergeant Beltran. He comments, "Instead of labeling myself as a post-traumatic stress disorder veteran, I say that I am a post-traumatic growth veteran. I am a person looking forward."
Not acceptance, but one of growth. And Judaism wants us to be forward-looking, active, and it should be done in this healthy space. Dear friends, that is for Lesson 5. Next week, our grand finale, the joy of the Spirit, exploring the deeper dimensions of happiness. Very special grand finale. We'll really go to the depth of the spirituality of happiness. I want to thank you all for joining, and may you all have a wonderful evening, a wonderful week, and we'll see you all next week. Looking forward to seeing you all then. All right. Take care, everyone.